Welcome back to my channel, guys. Okay, I love this design. I feel like it looks like one of those little like slutty stocking things. Like it's gonna go work the corner. I don't know. I love it. It's super easy. Let's get started. First off, we're doing the tumbler from Tipsy Magnolia. This is called the Lil Tipsy. I think it's about 2 to 3 ounces, super tiny. This is hot pink and powdered coated. I'm not going to sand this one. It does come with lid and straw. We don't need that though, so we're gonna put that right back in the box. These foils are from Mr. Nola's Glitter. It's from a Wonderlust collection like in 2022. I'm working on finding out if they can either do a pattern for this or where we might be able to find some stockings to duplicate this design. So for this right here, we have this whole piece of foil. It comes on this big strip and it's like lace on the back with foil on the front. I want to wrap this around the cup, but I don't want it to look like that foil is really chopped off in any sections. So we're going to go ahead and find a piece where if I do cut it, well, when I do cut it straight across, it's not going to look like a straight line. It's going to kind of play off with some of that. So there's a piece right in the middle that has a perfect break in it. So I went ahead and cut off that one side. I'm going to match it up and make sure it fits all the way around the tumbler and go ahead and cut that other side off too. Most of my tumblers are easier to work with if I put them on a turner arm, so we're sliding that in here right now, and then we're going to get started. I have this UV resin that I'm spreading around the top. I should have just done that top little section at a time, and you'll see why in a minute, but I'm spreading this out, and then I have this piece of foil that I'm laying on there. I'm going to pull it a little tight and wrap it around and hold it with my finger to make sure it's in place. The little extra UV resin that's on my gloves, I'm spreading that around to the top. That way it'll kind of soak through that little mesh just a tad. Once I started doing this, I realized that as I pulled the top tight, the bottom part of that got a little loose. So I covered the bottom of it with a napkin so the UV light wouldn't quite seal that all the way. I hit it with the light for about 30 to 45 seconds. I didn't want to set it yet. I just wanted it to be able to really kind of hold on in place. Once that was done, I went ahead and went all the way around my tumbler and I pushed in this foil. At this point, that UV resin was a bit tacky as opposed to how it is when it's fresh, and you could really push this foil in there and have it lay down flat. So I went all the way around, made sure everything was laid down the way that I wanted it. I held the little piece in place that I needed to make sure laid down flat. I put just a little more UV resin on that one spot that I really needed to lay down and then kind of spread it around throughout some of the other foil areas. That way it would soak in just like I did before. We're going to hit that with the UV light for just a little bit longer this time, maybe about a minute or so. Again, I'm not going full cure on these just in case there's a spot that I need to fix. If you do decide to go the UV route, make sure you're turning your tumbler in circles so that the whole thing kind of cures just a tad. This is the back of it like I was showing. I opted to use the front side where you don't see that mesh over the foil. The foil is kind of in the back. So depending on what side you use, make sure you do that same thing to the bottom. I'm wrapping this around the tumbler before I trim it just to make sure that it lines up nicely. Once I get that measured up, I'm going to go ahead and take my scissors and cut off the extra little piece and put that aside. Once again with the resin, we're going to go ahead and put on somewhat of a generous amount and put this about halfway around the tumbler. We don't want to go all the way around because just like before, we're going to tack this in sections to make sure that it's really going to sit where we need. Go ahead and smush it down and use that extra UV to work in between all of those little threads to make sure that it's soaked in. Hit it just a little with the UV lamp like we did before. Flip it to the other side, put another little generous bit of UV resin, spread that out, pull this tight, smush it down, and go ahead and work that UV resin so that it's back in between the threads. Once you're confident that it's all saturated, go ahead and hit it with the UV light, and this time we're going to do it a little longer for maybe about 2 minutes to make sure that it's all set in place. Next, I grabbed my scissors and I went around and started trimming off everything that wasn't tacked down. I didn't want this design to go all the way down to the bottom of the tumblers because the spiders that I wanted to put on, I wanted them to be hanging. And it was somewhere around this step that I realized that I would have to probably put a straight line or something. I didn't like that. So I grabbed my UV resin again, and some of these pieces that I didn't cut off all the way, I went ahead and laid those down because as I was cutting, I was like, oh man, this is going to end flat. How am I going to finish this design off for this? So like I said, tack some of those down, and then some of these pieces that we cut away, I'm going to go ahead and wrap those around that little edge, and I zoomed in here so you can see it, and I cut like really funky pieces. I didn't grab any straight pieces. Put your epoxy, let it soak in, trim off anything that's poking off that's going to be really stubborn because like I said, for the bottom, you don't want this to make sense. I wanted it to be like kind of sketchy I always say sketchy, I don't know the word, rustic, distress, I don't know. But I wanted it to not be like straight and pretty. I wanted it to have kind of a pulled look to it. So like I said, grab your UV resin, put a good amount in there, that way it soaks that little fabric down tight, smush down the foils into there also, and then cure it with your UV lamp. This time for this cure, we're going to do about 3 minutes or so. I did want to make sure that it's all the way cured, that way I could be finished with this step. Make sure you're also twirling it in circles to get everything. I have these little scissors and I'm going around the tumbler. There's a few spots that it overlapped just a little, especially along that seam where we matched it up. And I didn't want to have a giant seam. It's going to be easy to cover up later on, but I didn't want to have to fight with it. So I went ahead and cut those pieces off, and then I saw some pieces at the bottom that were a little too straight. So I went through with my knife and I kind of carved that out. Don't go too aggressive against this powder coat because you can scrape it off. My knife did slip in one section, and if you look close at the cup, you'd be able to see that little line. So be careful whenever you're going to do that. If you want a little like protection or like little security against that, do a layer of UV or a layer of epoxy before you do any of this work, and that will protect that powder coat altogether. Once I had everything cleaned off the way that I liked it, my design was set, I went ahead and cleaned off the bottom with just a little bit of rubbing alcohol to make sure anything loose was gone, and I brought it over to my turner. At this point, I realized that if I use a regular or maybe even a fast-setting epoxy, I may have to battle with some bubbles. So the easiest way around that was to put a layer of UV resin, smooth that out all the way, torch to pop any bubbles that are in there. You can also spritz with rubbing alcohol, and that's another good way to remove bubbles from UV resin. And then I put it under my light for a little longer this time. I did about 6 minutes because that's what Jennifer Parnell told me to do. And I'm being honest with you with that. She said that she found about 6 minutes was the right amount of time to get everything cured. So hey, if someone did the math, I'm just going to listen to them. After that was set, I went on with my regular epoxy. I'm putting some fairly forgiving vinyl on here, but it is going to have just a simple offset on it of silver. And when you're doing that silver metallic vinyl, you'll sometimes see any flaws through that vinyl. Like that metallic is not so nice sometimes. So I wanted to make sure that it would have a decent surface. So I got my epoxy on here, again, torch to pop any bubbles, and then go ahead and clean up my rim with my rubbing alcohol and dry baby wipe. As I said before, I'm a super visual person, and it's just easier for me to actually see how it's going to lay around the tumbler. So I designed these little spiders in Cricut Design Space, switched it to a print image, and then I just roughly cut it out to make sure that it's going to lay the way I wanted it to. I have my little Cricut mat that I'm putting this silver tech wrap metallic down on first so that the paper doesn't jump up at me. And then for the black, I'm using tech wrap textured vinyl. If you don't have this textured vinyl, oh my goodness, you have to get it. It is absolutely amazing. I love this stuff. It's super, super forgiving. It's really pretty. You can see the texture under epoxy. It's just nice, easy to work with. The other great thing about it is that if you do put it down and you mess up a little, you can lift it and then lay it back down without having any issues. It's great. I don't know. I can't say enough about it. It is really, really great. I stuck this all to one piece of transfer tape, and I set my Cricut fairly thick whenever I cut it, so for me it's easier to just turn my mat over and peel it away like that. I have this tumbler, and okay, you can see that seam right there. We want to cover that seam. So I'm taking this first long spider, and I want to make sure he goes all the way down. So I'm going to line him up where that string covers that seam. We are going to have a drip around this, so it's okay if it doesn't go all the way up to the top. Once I had that little guy in place, I held him down with my thumb and then smushed down the rest of that vinyl all the way down. If you're using a curved tumbler, make sure that you're digging into that little curve and it's really laying flat in there. If you stretch it too tight, it will have a little gap between the vinyl and the tumbler, and you'll have an issue with that and with it lifting whenever you do epoxy. So go ahead and put the rest of the spiders on there. This one fell off, so I'm putting that on there now. And then we're going to go through and straighten this out. If I had more patience, which we already know this issue, I shouldn't have to do it again, they would have went on straight and I wouldn't have to do this. But since I kind of, I don't know, lost all self-control, some of them went on a little wonky. So I just went around my tumbler and straightened out everything and made sure that it was laying nice on there. I do have this really neat curved ruler that I got from Create by Firefly that fits the curve of your tumbler. So if you just stand this right up against your tumbler, you can see if you have a straight line for anything, for vinyl, for anything in the world. It's really great. So highly recommend this little ruler. I'm now going to go through and trim off some of these little spider strings in the shape of the drip that I need. Now, if you do a layer of epoxy right now, you do not have to do this step, but I wanted to cut down on how many layers of epoxy I was going to have on this little Tipsy. So I went ahead with this and I kind of, like I said, made it in the little swooshes of how I think I wanted that drip to go. I am using puff paint for this drip, which is not going to be as forgiving as epoxy. Once puff paint dries, although it does puff up a bit and it's somewhat thick, if you have any vinyl under it, you will be able to see the vinyl. So I'm going to go ahead and do a little precaution here and trim those away. That way I won't see so much of that line. For puff paints, I got this little pack off Amazon and I just love it because you get a bunch of different colors. It has some softer ones and then some neons in there too. When you open this, do it upside down because if you open it right side up, you're going to make a mess. They're all going to fall everywhere. So shake your puff paint really good, and then I'm going to start with this whole thing sideways so it doesn't start dripping on me. And as I turn my tumbler, I'm going to go ahead and draw that line of how I want this puff paint to drip. I'm not going to turn it sideways until I get all this paint on there because like I said, I don't want it super drippy. I want it to go down just a little where their strings are, but mostly be somewhat of a thick top. Once you get that all the way around, we're going to start filling in the area at the top. I like to do circular motions. That way it's easier to sort of blend out this puff paint and you don't end up with streaks all through it. Once I had that down, I went ahead and rotated it sideways to help it smooth out, and then I thunked it down just a little. I didn't do too much here because like I said, I didn't want it to be super drippy. I took my puff paint again and a few edges that started to look creepy drippy, I went ahead and smoothed that and filled it in a little just to help play it off. I then took my finger and I went along the top of the tumbler and kind of tapped it. I wanted to be sure that drip was all the way towards the top. I am still going to pull that back and give myself a nice clean rim, but I wanted to make sure that it kind of had like a seamless look around there. And it did. It all came out really great. I'm really happy with this method. And like I said, don't come after me for using this puff paint. All right, it dried and you can see right there some of the drip. So I did a second coat. This sat overnight. That is, I think, the only downfall with using this puff paint is that it does take a bit to dry. I do this at the end of the day. That way I can walk away from it and I know that I'm not touching it because I'm sleeping. It's the only way I can let things go, guys. So once that did dry, I came to it the next morning and I went around and did the exact same thing with another coat. This only needed a second coat. Like I said, if you use epoxy or even a hot glue gun, a black hot glue gun for this or whatever color, you won't have to do a second coat. Or if you just put down a layer of epoxy first, you won't have to do a second coat. But I didn't like seeing some of those lines. A lot of times under epoxy, the black is forgiving. You can't see some of those bumps. I just didn't want to take the chance. The other reason why I'm using puff paint for this, anytime I'm a little undecided on how I want that drip to go, I do it in puff paint because if I don't like it, I take it right over to the sink and I wash it off. It comes off super clean. It doesn't leave a residue. There's times where this puff paint dried and then I just got my knife under it and I pulled it up and it all came up perfectly. And then I just washed it with soap and water, scrubbed away the dried glue, and I was able to go on right again. So like I said, that's the thing I definitely love about puff paint drips is that it's super forgiving, and if you don't like it, it's easy enough to just wash away and try again. Oh yeah, and the fact that it comes in like a bazillion different colors. For this layer, I do still want it to smooth out, so I spin it kind of aggressively in a few little circles to get it and then make sure it drips the same. And that's it for this one. Again, this was done at night, so I'm letting it sit. The next morning, I'm going to go to it. I'm going to do one layer of epoxy. This is fast cure epoxy, just so I can get on to that next step. Remember that I do not have a layer of epoxy over any of that vinyl. So when you do use your torch for this step, be gentle that you don't mess up your vinyl or burn any of that glue. So torch doesn't pop any bubbles. And like I said, fast cure for this. So we're going to let this sit for about 4 hours before we get the bottom done. If you're following that same method as I do, don't forget to take your rubbing alcohol and go ahead and clean off the top and bottom rim. I haven't pulled back that layer of paint yet. I'm going to do that with a craft knife. And I didn't show that step because I've done a bunch of tutorials on the edges. So if you have any questions on that, let me know. This bottom little piece of the Tipsy, it does come off. So just get your little knife and go under there and pull this right up. I went ahead and grabbed a little napkin with rubbing alcohol to make sure that I got off any leftover glue residue. I went ahead and grabbed a little piece of this mesh foil strip that I set aside from earlier, and I placed it on there, and I'm just trimming away kind of roughly the size that this needs to be. It's a 1-inch round. I do have a round hole puncher, but I'm not sure if it would work in this, so I figured I'd play it safe and just go ahead and trim it out little at a time. Once that size was set, I put a little bit of UV resin, put this down in here, spread it out with that popsicle stick, cleaned up the edge so that I don't have to fight with that. And then a silicone tool is really great for getting this to set in place. Once I had that pushed down really good and I knew that that part was saturated, I hit it with the UV lamp for about 30 to 45 seconds. Once that was done, I went ahead and smushed in any pieces of foil that may have been sticking up, and then stuck it right under my UV lamp for about 2 minutes to get the rest of that to set. I then realized that I wanted a spot for my spider, that it was just going to kind of fall into the background and get lost. And guys, if I would be able to really see and think out my designs ahead of time, I wouldn't fight so much with this, but I don't know, I just go. I get an idea and I go and I troubleshoot and take away and add as I go along. So I got the spider on there. I gave a little bit of UV resin on here, spread this out really well, made sure it was completely flat, and then I hit it with the UV light. I was really careful on this step that the layer of like the decoration on the bottom wasn't too thick where it would throw off the balance of my tumbler. So when my tumbler does sit on a surface, it sits against that pink. That inside part with the spider, it isn't touching my the table or whatever surface it's sitting on. It's not touching that at all. So once you get that UV down, I did go ahead and clean off this rim again, and this was the final little cleanup for the bottom. Set it under my UV light, and I did this for about 5 to 6 minutes to make sure everything cured for a bit. And then I went on with my last coat of epoxy to go ahead and finish up this design. As always, I do the bottom of my tumbler before I do that absolute last coat. That way, if my hands are sticky or if anything does drip to the side of my tumbler, I'm not ruining kind of my finished design. But that was it, guys. Torch to pop any bubbles, and you're done. Like I said, the tumbler kind of cracks me up because I really feel like it's gonna like walk the corners for Halloween. It really has like that little garter stocking, I don't know what it's called, but I don't know, it has that look to it that I feel like. But I really do love this design. I hope that you guys do too. Please leave me a comment and tell me what you think. Like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next tutorial that we'll have coming out next week. You guys have a great week, and I'll see y'all soon.